chapter 9, verses 24 to 27. This small portion of Scripture is, as I said earlier, foundational to my coming to faith. These verses that we're going to look at are overwhelming evidence of the historic authenticity of the Bible. Overwhelming evidence that God has a particular plan for his people Israel. Overwhelming evidence that Yeshua is Messiah. Overwhelming evidence that God is not done with Israel. And overwhelming evidence that there are things to come, clear, dire, and certain. For me personally, these verses represent that there is a God in heaven, that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that he is my God. From verse 24, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Then, after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And its end will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war. Desolations are determined. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Right, so brief overview. We see in these verses, we see a purpose and we see a timeline. The purpose is to give a timeline for God's revealed future plan, specifically for Israel. The timeline I break down into 7 parts. So the timeline you will see in verse 24. There is to be a decree, Daniel speaking into the future. There is to be a decree. Jerusalem is to be rebuilt. Messiah comes. Messiah is cut off and the temple is destroyed. There will be wars and desolations. Then there will be a treaty and abominations. And then there will be destruction of the one who makes desolate. So there are the seven parts of the timeline, and I'll deal with each of them. First, deal with the purpose. To understand this portion of Scripture, you have to understand why it's there, what it's there for, what it's trying to explain. So we're in verse 24. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city. This time of 70 weeks, and weeks, you're probably all familiar with the concept. So in the Hebrew thinking, in the way the scriptures work, in the way God works with time, a 7 is important. It's 7 groups of 7 weeks. Some Bibles will call it 7 sevens. Others will call it 7 weeks. It's 7 weeks of years, or 7 times 7 years. 70, well, I'm talking 7. 70 times 7. 70 times 7. 70 weeks of years. So 70 times 7 is 490. You older folk will know that because you did arithmetic and didn't use calculators. We youngsters, I still did arithmetic. Anyway, these 70 weeks, these 490 years are decreed specifically for God's people and the holy city. That's what it's about. And what's going to happen? What are these 70 weeks, these 490 years, what are they going to achieve? They're going to finish the transgression. They're going to, so the transgression, the ongoing transgression of Israel, they're going to make an end of sin. They're going to make atonement for iniquity. So there's going to be atonement, there's going to be payment for the price, a price paid for our sin. And it's going to be consummated. It's going to happen and it's going to be consummated in this time. It's to bring in everlasting righteousness, a lion lying next to the lamb. To seal up vision and prophecy. So all of the prophecies and the visions that there are here will be consummated in this time. And we'll be able to say, we've seen it all happen. Apart from the new heavens and the new earth. That's another story, and God tells us very little about that. And to anoint the most holy place. Must be the temple in Jerusalem. Right. Now, that's the purpose. Don't lose sight of the fact that these 70 weeks are about Israel, God's holy people and his holy city. Right. The timeline. 70 weeks of years, as I said, 490 years. Each week is 7 years. So there are those seven sections that we break the timeline into. The first section is the decree. It's in verse 25, where he says, when is all this going to kick off? From the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. So we're looking for a decree made by somebody that Jerusalem, which is then destroyed, to be rebuilt. And we find that decree in Nehemiah chapter 2, in verse 1. And it came about in the month Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. So if you read the context, you see that King Artaxerxes gives Nehemiah a decree: go to your city, go to Jerusalem, and rebuild it. This happened in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. You want to know when King Artaxerxes reigned? You go to Google and you look it up, which king, there are a couple of King Artaxerxes, which one reigned during the time that Nehemiah wrote, and you will find that Artaxerxes took the throne in 465 BC. The 20th year of his reign was 444 BC. Now, the verse says, in the month of Nisan. I'm told that in the way Hebrews deal with dates, if the day is not given, you assume that it is the first of the month. So, arguably, on the first day of Nisan, and definitely in 444 BC, is the decree that Daniel is talking about. He's talking about an event that happened 100 plus years after he wrote it, by the way. It happened, and Nehemiah records it. Right, the decree is for the rebuilding of the city, second part of the timeline. There in verse 25. From the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again. He's talking now about the rebuilding of Jerusalem. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Well, you read Nehemiah, you read Ezra, you see there the times of distress that it was built in. But it looks as though 49 years and the 62 weeks, which equals, where are the mathematicians here? 434 years, are dealt with separately for different reasons. So the rebuilding of the city, McDowell, anybody familiar with Josh McDowell? He says, and he draws from various scholars, it took 49 years to rebuild the city, because there's specificity here that it included the building of the plaza and the moat. So 49 years. And interestingly enough, well, that takes us to 395 BC. Interestingly enough, McDowell also claims that that is the year that Malachi was written and that the Old Testament canon closed. Right. 49 years to rebuild the city. Now there's still 62 sevens left. That's 434 years. From the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So not to rattle your mathematical brains too much, that is a total of 483 years. From the issuing of the decree until Messiah comes, 483 years. Obviously, there's still 7 years floating somewhere. So it is calculated that on the Jewish calendar, if you go from 1 Nisan 444 BC and you add 483 years, 360-day lunar years, you will arrive at 10 Nisan 33 AD. Now, Yeshua rode into Jerusalem and was hailed Messiah on the 10th day of Nisan. You read the Gospels, you'll work it out there from the Gospels, that he came into Jerusalem 5 days before the Passover. He rode into Jerusalem the same day that the Jews were taking their lambs in to inspect them for slaughter for the Passover. Jesus rode into Jerusalem on the 10th day of Nisan, and he was inspected. He underwent the scrutiny of the religious leaders, and he was proven spotless and without blemish. Isn't that amazing? The next part of the timeline, Messiah will be cut off and the temple destroyed, verse 26. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. With a flood means it will be overwhelming, because there are no floods on top of the hill. So Messiah is crucified at Passover on the 14th of Nisan, say 33 AD. If you want to argue about whether it was 33 AD or 20-something AD, that doesn't faze me at all, that. Here's the interesting thing. In 70 AD, the temple and the city were destroyed. The temple was destroyed stone by stone, and the city was sacked. Messiah had come in, he had to have come and gone by then. Daniel says so. And that's why the rabbis don't like you to read Daniel chapter 9, especially these verses. Here's an interesting thing that's relevant. The Christians were not in Jerusalem when Titus sacked Jerusalem and murdered over 1 million people. They had escaped. Why? Because they knew the words of Yeshua when he said, and you can read about it in Luke 21 from verse 20, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in the midst of the city must leave, and those who are in the country must not enter the city. So when the Christians saw Jerusalem surrounded by enemies, they remembered what Messiah had said, and they gapped it. He's not talking here about the end. He talks about the end in Matthew 24, and you pick it up from the context of both those sets of scriptures. So Jerusalem, the temple is destroyed, Jerusalem is destroyed, and we go into the next point in the timeline, wars and desolations. From verse 26, the second half, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. Yeshua said in verse 21, and this is what ties the warning that he gave to that event rather than what is yet to come. Verse 24 of Luke 21, and they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. We're still living in the times of the Gentiles. They're coming to a close. And one sign of that is what Scott was telling us a little earlier about all those Israelis coming here hearing about Messiah. We don't need a history lesson to know that from 70 AD, for the next nearly 2,000 years, the Jewish people have suffered wars and desolations. We don't need a history lesson to know that from 70 AD, Jerusalem has been trampled underfoot by the Gentiles. 50 years ago, Israel took control of all of Jerusalem. There's still some work to be done because they don't control the Temple Mount really. But to all intents and purposes, that time of the Gentiles trampling Jerusalem underfoot since 1967 has been drawing to a close. We're in those times, brothers and sisters. And it's exciting times. So there's that portion which deals with the last 2,000 years, and maybe a little more into the future from where we are in the timeline now. Now, the last week, the one that Daniel doesn't specify. He talks about the 483 years, and then he's quiet, and then suddenly we find the next 7 years. The clock stopped. God's timepiece, his clock for Israel, his clock for the time. Remember, this is about working with Israel, God working with Israel. He worked with Israel until Messiah came, and he stopped the clock. And Israel has been at the mercy of the Gentiles ever since. But when the last week, the last 7 kicks off, he's going to start that clock up again. And we're heading that way. We're heading for 7 minutes to 12 when he starts that clock again. And we know because the times of the Gentiles are passing. So here is where the 7 weeks, the last week, kicks off. The last 7 years. Verse 27. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, 7 years. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, a destruction that is, poured out on the one who makes desolate. That sounds very heavy, but I'll get back to that. The purpose of this last 7 years is to consummate all things concerning Israel, is to consummate God's work with Israel the way a potter works with clay. It commences when he makes a covenant with the many. Who is this he? If you go back to verse 26, you'll see it talks about the city being, the sanctuary and the city being destroyed by the people. So it's destroyed by people of the prince who is to come. So the city is destroyed by people, but their prince is yet to come. You see, the people who destroyed Israel, who destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, are the people of Antichrist, because the Antichrist spirit is with us even today. And Antichrist is yet to come. He is the prince to come. And he comes and is identified at the beginning of the last 7 years, in the last week. He is the one who makes a treaty. Who does he make the treaty with? Who does he make this covenant with? The verse says, with the many. But if you go to Isaiah chapter 28, you learn a little more. Verse 14, therefore, hear the word of the Lord, O scoffers, who rule this people, who are in Jerusalem. Because you have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with Sheol we have made a pact. The overwhelming scourge will not reach us when it passes, for we have made falsehood our refuge, and we have concealed ourselves with deception. How do I connect these scoffers who rule Jerusalem, who make a treaty, with this prince and this covenant? 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3. Know this, first of all, that in the last days, mockers, and the King James Version calls them scoffers, will come with their mocking, following after their lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation. The scoffers will say, where is this Messiah of yours? Never mind him, we are making a pact with death. We are making a pact with Sheol. We are making a pact with Antichrist. Now, it's in the middle of this week, it's in the middle of these 7 years, that the one that they make a pact with turns on them. He turns on them and he pulls the plug on all this temple stuff, and he sets himself up as an idol, as God. So for 3.5 years, Israel suffers under the heel of the one they made a pact with, under the heel of Antichrist. 3.5 years. How do I connect this? How do we connect it up? We look, well, Daniel says obviously in the middle of the week, it's 3.5 years. Daniel 7:25, they, the saints of the Holy One, in the context, will be given into his hand, into Antichrist's hand, for a time, 1 year, times 2 years, and half a time, 3.5 years. Revelations 11:2, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. Those of you who have taken out an HP on a motor car know that 42 months is 3.5 years of toil. Revelations 11:3, and I will grant authority to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth, 3.5 years. Revelation 12:6, then the woman, that is Israel, fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days, 3.5 years. Revelation 13, verse 5, there was given to him a mouth speaking arrogant words, the Antichrist, and blasphemies, and authority to act for 42 months was given to him. So there's the 3.5 years. That 3.5 years is tribulation. For who? Who's Daniel talking about? For Israel. Those 3.5 years are tribulation for Israel. What about the first half for Israel? What is the first half of that 7 years? Yes, peace, peace, brother. Exactly. That's what they're going to be saying. Peace, peace, because they've made a covenant with this man. And God, so for the whole of that 7 years, God is working with Israel. He's working with them for wrath, or with wrath in the second half. In the first half, he's working with them. How's he working with them? 144,000. 144,000 Jews who know Yeshua. Now, question. We all talk about 7 years of tribulation. The great tribulation of 7 years. 2 weeks ago I spoke in a church and I said the 7 years of revelation that you read about in Revelation, the 7 years of tribulation you read about in Revelation. Well, when I was preparing here, I started looking for that 7 years of tribulation. I don't find it. I don't see anywhere in Scripture that encompasses what we read about in Revelation into a 7-year period. As far as, here's my proposition. What you see in Revelation could be 30 years that God is pouring out his wrath on the earth, that he's working on the earth, with the earth. 7 years of that time, he's working with Israel. And of that 7 years, 3.5 of it is tribulation. The rest of Revelation, I don't know. The second half of the tribulation, this is the time of Jacob's trouble. And you read about it in Isaiah 28 from verse 14. And I want to read this because it's powerful. Therefore hear the word of the Lord, O scoffers, who rule this people who are in Jerusalem. Because you have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with Sheol we have made a pact. The overwhelming scourge will not reach us when it passes by, for we have made falsehood our refuge, and we have concealed ourselves with deception. Therefore thus says the Lord God, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone, a tested stone, a costly cornerstone for the foundation, firmly placed. He who believes in it will not be disturbed. Right. You've made a pact with Antichrist, but I have a pact with one that you can cling to, and if you believe in him, you'll be saved. And then I will make justice the measuring line and righteousness the level. Then hail will sweep away the refuge of lies, and the waters will overflow the secret place. Your covenant with death will be cancelled, and your pact with Sheol will not stand. When the overwhelming scourge passes through, then you become its trampling place. So, you're going to be making a pact with Sheol. Some will believe in Messiah and be saved. Those who aren't part of that salvation will be trampled by wrath. Jeremiah chapter 30. Alas, for that day is great. There is none like it, and it is the time of Jacob's distress, but he will be saved from it. In Zechariah 13 we read that 2 parts, it will come about in all the land, Israel, declares the Lord, that 2 parts in it will be cut off and perish, but the third will be left in it. Now, Matthew 24. Remember we read Luke 21, Jesus' warning about the destruction of Jerusalem. Believers flee. Matthew 24. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop, not go down to get things out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. Pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, who are the elect, Israel, those days will be cut short. And he's not shortening anything. He's kept its 42 months, 4.5 years, 1,260 days. It will end at that point. How will it end? Daniel 9:27. A complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. It ends when the Antichrist is destroyed completely. Zechariah 14. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations whom Antichrist is using, as when he fights on the day of battle. You know, when the Lord fights on the day of battle, he's not relying on the Israeli Air Force. He's not relying on the tanks. He's not relying on the Iron Dome. He's not relying on the missiles. He fights as in the day of battle. He says to Gabriel, who's the guy who made them drink water out of the... Gideon. Send them home, send them home, send them home. I don't need them, send them home. He will come and fight as in the day of battle. Verse 9, and the Lord will be king over all the earth. Verse 16, then it will come about that any who are left of all the nations that went against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate the Feast of Booths. This message cuts to the heart, doesn't it, brothers and sisters? But there's hope. There's joy. Zechariah 12:10, they will look on me whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son. How are they going to know? To recognize the one whom they've pierced? Because we're going to be telling them. Because Romans 1:16 says, and who's going to say it with me? For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Gentile. Matthew 24, Jesus said, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. How are they going to know to flee to the mountains? Because we're going to pass the message on to them. And it's a question that I have. It's a question that I have. We focus a lot on Isaiah 53, and we focus a lot on introducing Messiah. I'm not aware that there's much of a drive for bringing these warnings and for telling of what's coming. Because we need to be saying, when this abomination happens, flee for the mountains. Because those who know that message will be saved. Those who believe what Yeshua said. Because Revelations 12:6, then the woman, that is Israel, fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. I'm going to sum up the last week, the last 7 years for you. Israel says, where is that Moses? He's been up the mountain for 40 days. We're tired of waiting for him. Make for us a God that we can see and worship. Israel will say, where is this Messiah? Let us turn to Sheol and make a pact with Sheol. Sheol will save us from God's wrath. And then God's going to use Antichrist to destroy those who reject him. And he's going to hide those who love him in a secret place. And then Yeshua is going to come, and he's going to utterly destroy the one who destroyed Israel, the unfaithful in Israel. And God's going to take the faithful remnant, and he's going to place them in Israel, and Yeshua is going to rule. That's the end of it. At the end of the 70 weeks, at the end of the last week of the 70 weeks, Yehovah's work with Israel will be complete. Yeshua will be king in Jerusalem. He will be their God, and they will be his people. Thank you.
I don't know if you remember the first time you heard about the 70 weeks, and perhaps you thought like I did, oh, come on, this is fairy tales. I mean, this is crazy. You really, really believe this? And then faith, God gave you the faith to believe, and then you began to read other prophecies and saw all of his other prophecies have come true exactly to the letter and to the day. Doesn't it excite you to know that you're part of a history past, present, and future? And that what we're doing in terms of our outreach to Jewish people, particularly Israelis, we are actually seeding into this end-time community of a remnant that will be saved. It's really quite amazing that we're attached to this. And Anton, thank you for so eloquently laying out this prophecy. Praise God.